Einar Nerman was born one of a pair of twins into a middle-class family in the Swedish town of Norrköping in 1888, where his father was a successful bookseller. In childhood he evinced a strong inclination towards the arts, including music and dance, alongside his obvious fascination for drawing. And when he left school in 1905 at the age of 17, he enrolled into the Artists' Union School in Stockholm. In 1908 he left Sweden for Paris to study with the painter Henri Matisse, and he also had further tuition at the Accademia Rossi. During his time in Paris he lived a bohemian lifestyle with a group of other like-minded students, and alongside his painted work drew quite a few caricatures of his friends and acquaintances. Although he was trying to make progress as an artist, in 1911 he also created a humorous poster for a Swedish theatrical production, and in the same year his first children's book, The Crow's Dream, was published. But these rather poor low-resolution images are the best I could find. Apparently in no hurry to make a living from his work, in 1912 he returned to Sweden to study music and dance at the drama school run by Elin Svensson. At what stage he finished his training there I haven't been able to find out, but in 1915 his edition of Hans Andersen's Thumbelina was published in Sweden, showing a marked upturn in the expressiveness of his style. And around the same time even more convincing evidence was plain to see in what would be the first in a long line of remarkably minimalist stylish covers for sheet music of popular songs of the period. Sweden was a neutral country during the Great War, and consequently Nerman's career wasn't interrupted. So the sheet music commissions continued to roll in, and he approached each with great imagination, using only a single colour and black. Although every one of these images pushed at the boundaries of what might fairly be called illustration, they managed to communicate with eloquence and frequently gentle humour. In 1916 he married Kajsa Eriksson, and over their years together they produced 4 children. In the same year, his illustrated edition of the story of Gösta Berlings by Swedish writer Selma Lagerlöf was published with some atypical wash illustrations of the characters involved. At this time Nerman also began applying the same methods and mindset to posters he created for both silent movie screenings and dramatic performances in Sweden. He also worked in stage and costume design, but I could find no meaningful evidence to show. But there were more striking examples of both his sheet music covers and poster work created up to the beginning of the 1920s. And at the start of the decade he produced his illustrated songbook Lasse Liten and Other Nursery Rhymes, complete with musical scores. A couple of years earlier he had met the immensely successful Welsh actor, singer and writer Ivor Novello, who had suggested that Nerman's caricatures would find a warm welcome among the stars of London's West End theatres. And in 1921 he and his family did relocate to the English capital, where he was immediately commissioned by the Tatler magazine to create humorous portraits of the very celebrities and productions Novello had predicted. And not much later this association also led to more of a similar nature for the fashionable magazine Eve. Nerman soon became a prominent fixture in the very world he chose to illustrate, and when Ivor Novello opened his glamorous 50/50 nightclub, he commissioned him to create an appropriately celebrity-themed mural. But although now resident in London, he was still creating work for publication in Sweden, and in 1922 he published some remarkably assured and entertaining Christmas images for publication back home. In the following year he published a children's book about the knight Finn Confusenfek, for which I can only find the cover and this solitary double-page spread. But in the same year he returned to the writing of Hans Andersen with his edition of the story of the swineherd. This book contained an abundance of delicately executed pen and watercolour wash illustrations of considerable aesthetic appeal. In these images he persisted with the idea of precise and frequently geometric fine line work, but the colour washes were applied tonally, giving the book a more traditional romantic appeal. It was a popular success, although at the time the success was confined to his own country. 1924 saw the publication of Nerman's first foray into the creation of an alphabet book for young children, and he more than rose to the challenge with a series of simple but appealing flat stylized images which were freestanding and balanced attractively on each page with the text. In the middle of the decade, Nerman also designed an appealing geometrically informed pack of playing cards, and a range of enamel tableware in his favoured red and black also went into successful production at this time. Although resident in London, he didn't let this interfere with his continued production of work for the Swedish market, and by this point his illustrations had become popular and widely published in both countries. In 1929 he published Darlings of the Gods, a retrospective collection of 7 years' worth of caricatures created for the Tatler. His friend Ivan Novello wrote the introduction, and although there were quite a few black and white only images, the book also featured a series of highly attractive and well observed 2-colour examples. These images were the very essence of Art Deco styling, and although the ephemeral nature of celebrity status means most of his subjects mean little to contemporary eyes, their aesthetic merits can't be disputed. As with quite a lot of Nerman's output, these images were all originally painted, and quite casually so, in gouache, and it was the lithographic print process which rendered them as pure flat images to their considerable benefit and graphic styling. In the same year he also published a collection of musical caricatures in the second Minuet, written by English composer Maurice Besley. In 1930 Nerman, his wife and children returned to Sweden and spent some of the considerable amount of money he had by now earned from his illustrated work to date on the purchase of Herbsieholm, a grand 18th century house in Liding Island. In 1932 he illustrated another Swedish language alphabet book, which was yet again printed in flat red and black, and it was another highly attractive and easily understood publication for early learners. It was also around this time that he first began creating seasonal greetings cards, which proved to be immensely popular in Sweden. Many of these have the appearance of pochoir stencil prints, although I have no firm evidence to back that up, and it's possible they were printed lithographically from pen and watercolour originals. But however they were created and reproduced, they were a uniformly vibrant and charming series of traditional seasonal imagery. In 1935 he was one of a group of illustrators to be commissioned for the series collected under the name Guldmotet, which translates as Golden Moth. These were selected fairy tales, most of which had been taken from Hans Andersen, and the series ran successfully for several years. Nerman's contributions were a mix of gouache-painted fantasy images printed in full lithographic colour, and there were some equally attractive, harder-edged black and whites in support. And he illustrated several of these over the next few years, all of which were widely read by Swedish children. In 1936, the Solstikan Match Company used a slightly amended drawing from his earlier Thumbelina to appear on their matchboxes, and not only is it still in use, but it's since become a widely merchandised image. In the later 1930s he appears to have slowed his output down somewhat, but he was still creating greetings cards designs, and it was at this time that he began creating images of his friend, the notoriously reclusive Swedish actor Greta Garbo, both as caricatures and more serious portraiture. Advertising was never a significant feature in Nerman's output, but I did find this agreeable 2-colour example of a press ad for cigarettes in 1939. A year later he and his family relocated to New York, where he was hired by the New York Journal-American to draw Hollywood and Broadway stars, and he set about this task with similar enthusiasm to his earlier images for the London Theatre. It was with this large volume of commissions that he kept occupied in the war years, and many of these images were collected in his 1946 book simply titled Caricature. alongside the many images of the famous and glamorous of the USA's show business scene, rendered in both monochrome and his favoured mix of red and black. The book also served as an instructional publication, with some drawn and written insights into his working methods. The same year saw the publication of Fairy Tales from the North, which, as you might expect, once more included a generous helping of stories from Hans Andersen's work. Because Nerman was by this point well and truly established as an international popular success, the book was published in many countries, including all of Europe and the USA. The colour pages were consistently bright and harnessed fanciful palettes, and it was applied both flat and with more textured effects in gouache. It was a particularly engrossing collection of fantasy images of playfully realised characters and environments, and on occasion Nerman took obvious pleasure in introducing some agreeably frightening and grotesque elements into the pictures too. The book also contained many black and white illustrations, and with Nerman's faultless sharp-edged stylisation, they made for an equally compelling and entertaining collection of graphic devices and page headers, guaranteed to delight young readers. In 1947, his book A Trip to Gingerbread Land was also published in several languages, and this charming and agreeably absurd collection made creative use of formally composed, generally flat-painted images set against page white. And this was just one of 3 books by Nerman published in that year. Dalahaston and other stories explored similar graphic terrain to the Gingerbread book, and so did the same year's Gubba Med Rim, which translates into the somewhat baffling Old Men with Rhymes, both with the same illustrative and popular success. Following this remarkable period of prolific creativity, it seems he took a break for a few years at least, and in 1950 the Nerman family returned to Sweden and took up residence again at Häsbyholm. In that year his book Come Let's Play was published. This time around it appears that the full-coloured images were printed flat rather than painted, which was certainly not to their detriment. And this approach was mirrored in the larger number of 2-colour red and black pages. These playfully explored layout and the image's relationship with the typography of the rhymes featured throughout this particularly charming and visually engrossing collection for younger children. I don't know if it was only published in Sweden at the time, but I certainly didn't encounter any English language versions. In 1953, he and his wife Kajsa published the book Celebrities and Delicacies in Sweden, featuring a somewhat strange combination of reprints of Nerman's caricatures alongside food recipes. It was some 4 years later in 1957 that he published an illustrated collection of musical scores titled Grandfather's Songs, following which he appears to have taken a break from illustration and worked more as an artist. How successful he was in this regard I have no idea, but it wasn't until another 10 years had passed in 1967 that he published a children's book, Kalles Skansen-besök, a title which translates into complete gibberish via Google, so you will just have to endure my attempt at Swedish in this instance. In 1969 he published his last book, The Wedding in Valköping and Other Animal Tales, which appears to be at least predominantly reprints from earlier books, although there may have been a few new additions too. And the only later evidence of his work came in the form of this 1974 poster, which may well have been using an image created far earlier, and a live series of decorative plates, first manufactured in 1976. Following a remarkable career of more than 60 years and a life well lived, Einar Nerman died in 1983 at the age of 95. Given the direction children's illustration has taken in subsequent years, turning increasingly to the use of bright flat colour and simple geometric shapes, it's easy to take what Nerman created for granted. But in his time he was undoubtedly one of the most important and radical pioneers working in that market, and I would be hard-pressed to think of anyone who did so any earlier. Similarly, his radical stylised caricature work also had a pronounced influence on quite a few later exponents, including Al Hirschfeld in the USA and Robert Sheriffs in Britain. And even now, many younger illustrators working with digital vector graphics have much to learn from his pioneering work of a century ago.